Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. It's been a bit since I last recorded. Took some time off during the holidays, and as things happened to go, I ended up dismantling some of the setup. I was pretty happy with the setup I had, and so now putting it back together. Hopefully this one works. Um, and we'll get back in the swing of things of getting some of these out to you more readily. I thought what I might do for the first video of 2024 was take a look back at 2023 and just hit on a few trends that I noticed in 2023 and how those might affect things going forward in 2024. What you might want to keep in mind as you're thinking about, just what you're doing as far as like your career, job, or technology you need to care about and whatnot in and around Postgres for 2024. Three of these are kind of like trends. Maybe the fourth one is a trend that sort of spawned from a question. So we'll get into that and whatnot. So I might as well go ahead and kick it off. Let me start with the first one. And the first one is that the Postgres community is back. Right? And what I mean by that is we've kind of been watching conference attendance pick up over the last couple of years. Obviously, pandemic hit, everybody pretty hard. 2019 was a banner year, and then 2020 things got canceled and postponed and whatever. And so now we're kind of seeing that recovery. And we're hot on the heels, so to speak, of PGConf EU, which was last month, had record attendance. And I think, depending on what you count as a New York conference, I think it had pretty close to record attendance. It was very well attended, anyways. And we're expecting in 2024 the Postgres Developer Conference will most likely expand. And so conferences are pretty well attended now. And there's a number of them. We saw expansion in the Postgres community with the past summit, had a Postgres wing, and all things open, which is kind of a non-Postgres but general open source conference, had its highest level since pandemic. So I think if you're into the conference scene or you're wondering about going and meeting people who are in the community, learning, networking, and doing that kind of thing with those in-person events, like that ecosystem is now back at a level that I think is really good to sustain folks, and probably will continue to grow, but I think it's really in a good place as far as that goes. I think the two things that I'm kind of wondering about for 2024, right? Even though we see things are really good and cranking along nicely at the sort of high conference level, the two things that I want to keep an eye on for 2024 are the local meetup scene and kind of maybe more regional conference oriented stuff. And from the meetup aspect, part of that is I think meetups in general are just not where they were, and I don't know if like meetup is like past its prime or whatever, and that's just not going to come back. I think there are some things that are not going to really come back in the way that they were before the pandemic. Meetups might be one of those. We did have a lot of people asking at conferences, where I was doing like community booth work and that kind of thing, asking about Postgres meetups that were local to the cities that they were in. So I would say if you wanted to start one, I certainly wouldn't dissuade you from that. Like, I think it's probably a good idea. If you're in the US, contact postgresql.us nonprofit, and they have a whole setup for doing user groups and helping you with some funding and getting speakers and all that kind of stuff, coordinating efforts and all that jazz. So definitely, I would say reach out, because I think that there is a demand for it, but we're waiting to kind of see, like, is that going to pick up in the way that it was beforehand, and just how is that going to work? So that's one of the things I'm kind of watching to see how well that does. And then the other thing that I think on the regional conference level, like in Europe, they've got it pretty well for what Europe wants. I think in the U.S. though, we definitely have not quite like hit our stride. And the thing that I really wonder about is when I say community is back, again, I'm talking about that sort of in-person conference, you know, activity and going to conferences and that kind of thing. That I think if people want to do that, it's great. From a Postgres community standpoint, though, let's say our numbers are the same as they were in like 2018, 2019 at these big conferences. The thing you have to realize, though, is that the actual Postgres community as a whole has actually grown by leaps and bounds over the last 4 or 5 years, right? Since that time, the Postgres community, like if you look at surveys of folks coming in, like every year, like we are just getting more and more people coming into the Postgres community, being introduced to Postgres, learning about it, and starting to work with it and that kind of thing. So we haven't hit that saturation point by any means, and I only see it growing further. So I think the question is what got us to where we were in 2018, 2019, does that model still work for what we would really like to accomplish in 2024, 2025, and going forward? Uh, so we'll see what happens on that front. There are some people, that are involved in that kind of work, and I help out with that stuff as I can. So we'll see where that all goes, and that's something to keep an eye on. But by and large, like I said, the summary of the trend is that if you wanted to go to conferences and get either whether it's training or networking and whatnot, you definitely could do that now. And I think we're in a pretty good place for that type of activity within the Postgres community. So that's good. Another thing, again, a trend of 2023, I'm sure will continue to be a thing in 2024, is this idea that, vectors are the new hotness. What every, AI and vector databases and all that has made a lot of noise. Most of it, I think, fairly well justified within the industry. And if you look at it, one of the things that's been interesting is, there were a bunch of startups that came out that were specialized vector databases. And, in the history of databases, I think it's an interesting industry because when you think about it, 10 years ago, and certainly 20 years ago, a new storage implementation, whether it's like a storage data type, or even a new indexing method, could have been enough to launch a product and make a whole business around it. And that's not entirely not the case now. You still see some of that type of activity, but it is a little bit different, right? And it certainly depends on the nature of, like, if you're thinking like columnar storage would be one thing, difficult to do and build and optimize around and all that. Less so just a storage data type like document databases. Now you could build a JSON specific document database, or you could build data storage types within Postgres and have something that's probably on par with what the document specific solutions can do. And that's even more true for indexing. And that's one of the things with vector databases that, the primary advantage that they have over a traditional relational database is all about the indexing, right? That's the order of magnitudes difference that you see right out of the gate. But the problem is that implementing new index types in most databases actually isn't like terribly difficult. And Postgres happens to actually be one of the easier ones to do that in, due to its open source nature and extensibility and whatnot. And so, like with vector indexing for these like vector types and doing vector searches, like Postgres already actually had extensions to do this, which is one of the reasons why it was picked up so early as a thing that people might actually use instead of vector specific databases. And so now there's a couple of startups out there that are building on top of Postgres and whatnot. So I think that puts a lot of pressure if you're trying to do something that's not Postgres. It's a lot of pressure to keep up with the Postgres thing. From a user standpoint, that's actually great. If you're a Postgres user now, you run Postgres databases, right? Whether you're like DBA, system person, whatever, developer, so much of the knowledge you have and tooling that you already have can be reused doing vector workloads with Postgres, right? And with the Postgres extensions. So I think the things to keep in mind, like if your company says, hey, we want to start doing some experiments with vector searches and, doing some kind of AI work or whatever, when they say that, like it's, raise your hand and say, hey, Postgres can handle those kinds of workloads. Like we can do that. And if we do it with Postgres, then we don't have to understand how do we do like backups and restores and all that stuff, like all that kind of infrastructure. We already have the tools and the knowledge in place to handle that because, this stuff it's just baked in Postgres stuff like extensions and index types and that kind of stuff. So would strongly recommend you raise your hand for those kinds of things and get involved in that and then keep an eye on it. If you are getting into that space, if that is a workload that you are having to deal with, one thing to keep in mind is that a lot of that development and a lot of the information around that is not going to happen in core Postgres. And it's not that like core is against vector or anything like that. It's just that, things like indexes, to keep them external, at least in a period of sort of high growth and high iteration, which is what we have going on in that space now, right? There's different indexing types that are being kind of bandied about. And so being able to iterate those and make those releases and make those improvements outside of the core release schedule is actually a pretty decent, feature, I guess if you want to call it that. It's a feature of the Postgres model and people who want to use that technology. So you need to find where that kind of stuff is going on and keep your ear to the ground, outside of kind of the mainstream Postgres channels to hear that information. But they shouldn't be too hard because most of the Postgres players are realizing this is a big workload that people are looking into. and we can make a lot of money selling vector solutions to people, and why not use Postgres for the basis of that? Makes a lot of sense on a number of levels. So that's definitely a trend from 2023. Expect to see more of it in 2024, and how close you get to that on the technical side, whether you're running those workloads or not, will be how much you need to really pay attention to it. It's not going to dominate Postgres. Postgres is too big for any one particular thing like that to completely dominate it. So if you're not running those workloads, don't feel like, oh my God, I'm not going to be able to use Postgres in 5 years because I won't know how it works anymore. That's completely not the case. So, pay attention as needed. But if you have those workloads, volunteer for it, go after it. You might as well do it in Postgres. And it's pretty interesting stuff. Kind of dovetailing on the vector stuff is what I've kind of noticed with Postgres venture funding. 2023 was considered a down year for venture funding in the tech industry as a whole. I think if you're in the Postgres space and not in the wider tech industry, you probably actually thought it was a pretty good year for funding. Postgres is not usually a hotbed of funding activity, but in this case, because a large part because of the vector stuff, it actually did get decent funding and decent, I think, sort of credibility within that space. And if you go back a couple of years, like the kind of two that I thought got really good mind share and carried that from the start of the year all the way to the end, were like Supabase doing their developer oriented stuff and sort of making extensions much easier to use and getting that out to developers and whatnot, and building APIs for that stuff, including vector capabilities within their platform. So they were a big one. I think another one, Tembo, got a lot of attention, again, focusing on extensions and building sort of application platforms for different workloads and sort of class of problems and trying to solve it at that layer. So that's another one that's out there. There's a little bit older ones. Like there's definitely some newer ones like Lantern, UbiCloud, PureDB. Shouldn't forget PG Edge is another one. They're doing like multi-master things. So these ones are kind of trying to solve different problems. But again, like we're getting venture money in, and there's definitely other startups out there. Didn't name them all. They came out last year or like late 2022. And so that is going good, and I'm sure we're going to see some more here in 2024. We'll make announcements and do some launches. So keep an eye out for that. And all of that, I think, is generally good for the Postgres community, right? You get, to put it, not to sound like a politician, but like we're going to create jobs. Like it creates jobs, it creates people with more experience with Postgres. Hackers of Postgres will have more opportunities to do their hacking, and they can go learn at some of these other companies different ways of getting involved with Postgres source code, and then be able to float around in the future to help build bigger and better things within Postgres. So I think all that is good. Like that funding should be pretty helpful. And again, like it's a large community with Postgres, so these companies that are going to come in, there'll be disruption in how they attack certain workloads and problems and features and whatnot, but none of it will be big enough to like sink the community or anything if it goes sideways and whatnot. So I think that's all pretty good. The one caveat that I'm a little concerned about is one thing I noticed. If you were to go back like 2 to 3 years and the startups that were running then, a lot of those were using like Postgres and BSD and actually predominantly Apache 2 licensing. So all of those were using like real open source licenses for their code. And as a user, that's great because you ideally would like to have access to the source if you need it, and then freedom to do what you need to do, and you don't have to talk to a lawyer in order to actually use the software. So that's great. What I've noticed with the newer startups that are coming out that are building Postgres based products, like not just a startup, a lot of startups are actually picking Postgres as like their database of choice, and then building a thing on it, but they're not like Postgres solution companies, right? So I'm talking about like for the Postgres solution companies, one thing that's a little concerning is most of them seem to be drifting towards business source licenses up front, which are kind of like the Mongo or Elastic stuff that's going on now. HashiCorp is moving in that direction where it's not really an open source license. It has restrictions on it that from a corporate standpoint, I can understand why a lot of them are doing it. And I can understand why users maybe don't actually care, and that can be a fair thing. But ideally, you'd like to have, the ability to just use it as a normal open source product. And I talked with the PG Edge guys when they made their announcements, last year and then early this year about, they like their core sort of pieces that are in Postgres, they're like, no, ideally we'd open source everything, right? And they're like, any patches that we need to core Postgres, we're totally going to open source those, and that's great. We have some other pieces around the management and infrastructure piece that we are doing, like BSL style license, because we just want to keep people who are going to use the system in that way coming to us, right? And we'd like to have control over the product and whatnot. And we don't really want to stop anyone from innovating, but we also want to make sure that there's going to be development and money put towards those efforts and towards those solutions. Like, we need to be able to shepherd that, right? And not just have somebody else take it and spin it up, and then they're kind of siphoning off money away from the future development of the solution that we're trying to build. I think all that makes sense. And in fact, I would say, Postgres is BSD licensed. I'm a proponent of keeping these Postgres derivatives that are not open source, like, be welcoming towards those communities, because I think that BSD licensing is a real big winner for Postgres in the long run. And I also think, these companies now don't want to have to end up in a place where they're doing like some kind of bait and switch thing, like with Hashi, where, people got very upset after spending years putting time, energy, resources into building up Hashi, Terraform community and that kind of stuff, to then have it be relicensed. That did not sit well with a lot of people. And so I think now companies are like, well, we're just going to, from the get-go, right? We can always make it more liberal, more open. If we start with a BSL type license, and then later we get to a point where we feel comfortable open sourcing the whole thing under, sort of a true open source license, we can do that, right? And I think that's fine. And, but also as a user, I would say be careful with those promises, because it assumes the company will be there and the same people will be running it who feel that way. And that may not be the case if they're not under that. So I understand why companies are doing that. Obviously protecting from certain cloud providers and other sort of automated infrastructure companies, like those arguments, I get them. As an end user, though, right, I want to maximize my own freedom when it comes to that technology. So I just say keep an eye on that. I'm a little concerned because I see most of the newer startups seem to be leaning away from that, going towards the BSL licenses, which seems kind of bad for open source. So again, we'll see how that all plays out as 2024 goes on. So the last thing I just wanted to touch on also, it's kind of like I said, it's sort of like trend, was spawned from some questions on one of the Slack channels I'm in, and it started, the trend piece of it is this idea of people moving from the cloud back to hardware. And I think where this spawned was David Heimler Hansen. He's a founder of Ruby and co-founder of 37 Signals, known as DHH. He wrote a blog post, I forget exactly when, it was back in early 2023, I believe, talking about how he had looked at the margins. So as 37 Signals has a product called Basecamp, and they have some other products as well. They have Hey, which is like an email thing. And they had moved most of their workloads, maybe all of their workloads into the cloud. And he was looking at what they were spending on the cloud cost versus like what it would take to run those same workloads in purchased hardware, right, back in a data center. And he just thought, like, the amount of money we're spending is crazy. We could do this dramatically cheaper if we go back to the data center. But there's some caveats to that. And he wrote this all in a blog post of like why our workloads work for that and other ones don't. And in fact, their own workloads, like Basecamp, it's a product, I don't know, it's been around at least 10 years, maybe 20 years. And it's software as a service, and they kind of manage the whole thing. And they're not going to get like 10x growth in a day, it's not that kind of a product. They have a pretty steady state workflow, and they understand their growth patterns. And so they can make it very predictable versus something like Hey, which is their email thing, which is a much newer product that they have put out, also software as a service. That was built in the cloud to begin with, and I believe still runs in the cloud. But in any case, he wrote this blog post. A lot of people got excited about it. He went on some podcasts and whatnot, and talked to folks about why they were doing this and how much money they were saving and all that. And I think people, where the questions sort of came in is like, hey, with people moving from the cloud back to hardware, like how important is learning cloud tooling especially for like database people, right? And like sysadmins and sort of those folks who may have started on hardware and now, if you've been resistant to the cloud, you're looking at this and saying like, oh, good, the trends are we're moving back. And tech is pretty cyclical. So I understand why some people might think like, oh, that cloud trend is over and now we're going back to hardware. And so I can ride out the rest of my career on hardware, right? And I saw sort of a different version of this for folks that, if you only got in the industry in the last 5 years and everything is cloud, then you're like, do I need to learn hardware? Is that something I have to do? And so let's see, in the immortal words of Taylor Swift, like, you need to calm down. Um, that trend, I think, is like, it's fake news essentially, right? It's not that people are not doing this, and it's not that it's not even a good idea. It probably is a good idea for a lot of people who have fairly static workloads with fairly predictable growth. You could save a lot of money by moving that stuff, either by keeping it on hardware, keeping it in a data center, versus putting it in a cloud system, right? That is all very real. But the idea that like a lot of companies are doing this, and the idea that like a lot of workloads are being pushed out of the cloud and back to hardware, that just simply isn't true. And I would say you, at your own peril, ignore understanding and learning the cloud tools, right? Even if that means like, hey, I'm only going to run Postgres in like EC2, right? And so that I still have command line level access and all of that. Like, I get it. Like, I understand why people want that. I understand why DBAs want that. But you still need to, I think, be open to the idea of learning about EC2 and understanding how that works in these virtualized instances, and those pieces. You got to understand all that stuff, and you got to learn that stuff. Maybe not today, but soon, right? Like that, those things are coming for you. And even though this is making some noise now about these people moving it back to hardware and stuff like that, it's like a micro trend within the industry as a whole. So I would not bank on that. Right. If you worked at 37 Signals, and you probably wouldn't be watching this because I believe they use mostly MySQL there. Hey, see, they're not all smart. But in any case, like, if you're at a company that is doing this, like, good for you, like, that's fine. But if you're thinking about a long-term future of your career, like, I'm telling you, continue to learn the cloud stuff. That is the way that it is going. And this sort of micro trend, it makes a lot of headlines because people, like the idea. The folks over at Oxide doing, rack style computers and whatnot. Like, it's very interesting. I have a framework laptop I'm waiting, for to get shipped to me. So like, I understand hardware and the appeal of it, especially of a certain age. You might be into that kind of thing. But as a trend, like, this is not a real trend that you should be putting your career on. Don't worry about that. These people moving it back. Like, it's interesting. Some of the tooling is there. It may be something that makes sense for what you're doing. If you have the right kind of workloads and understand your growth patterns and whatnot, like, it might be worth looking into. Don't bake your career on that. So, okay. So that was kind of the third thing. Like I said, it came from some questions, kind of trend related, and just wanted to let people know that. The last thing I was going to mention, just kind of want to wrap some stuff up here. As we close it out, last month I did an appearance on Path to CitusCon. Is a podcast. Is it an appearance? I was on their podcast, and it's from the folks at Microsoft and Azure Cosmos database for Postgres, or whatever that thing is. The Citus folks over there, and I had actually a really good time. Had it's not a co-host. It was a co-guest. Was Lucas Fiddle from PG Analyze. Really smart dude. Love what he does with PG Analyze. Good stuff. And so we had a conversation, kind of long form, it's about an hour and a half-ish, discussion around Postgres and monitoring and various aspects of that. So they released it on YouTube. So I have added their video into, I have a playlist for like Robert Around the World or whatever that's kind of links to external videos. So I've released that one, or I put that one into my playlist. So if you want to check that conversation out, you can find that in the playlist. Also, if you're looking at any of the uploaded videos that I have, a lot of these are like older talks that I've put up. If there's ones in particular that you're like, hey, there's an issue with the video or whatever, like, I tried to turn like captioning and whatnot on, so I have a lot more flexibility with what I can do with those uploaded now in the channel, from all of my old talks. Some of those I might re-record. A couple people have asked about maybe updating and whatnot. So if you're interested in any of that, please let me know. I guess the other big thing is, if you know someone who is working with Postgres, a DBA that's out there, if they have questions, concerns, want advice on how to run Postgres, help them. If you can, share the channel with them, let them, if you want to subscribe or have them subscribe, any of that would be totally cool. Would definitely appreciate that. And then other than that, like, I will definitely try to do these a little more regularly going forward. I've got some other stuff in the works that I hope to publish pretty soon, so we'll also get on that. And until then, like, take care of yourself, and if you can, take care of your database. and I will see you in the next one.